Ava Carter stepped onto the airplane with the kind of presence that naturally drew attention. Though she never sought it. Dressed in a tailored blazer over a sleek, form-fitting dress, she exuded quiet confidence, her every movement deliberate and composed. Her natural curls framed her face elegantly, adding a touch of warmth to her otherwise polished appearance. In one hand, she carried a high-quality leather laptop bag, while in the other, she held her boarding pass with the ease of someone accustomed to traveling in luxury. As she moved down the aisle of the first-class cabin, her sharp yet observant eyes scanned the seat numbers, ensuring she was heading in the right direction. She walked with a purposeful stride, neither hurried nor hesitant, making it clear that she belonged in this space. Though she did not demand recognition, some passengers took a second glance at her, curiosity flickering in their expressions. But Ava paid them no mind. She had taken flights like this before, and today was no different. She knew exactly who she was and where she was going. Reaching her assigned seat, she offered a polite smile to the man seated beside her before gracefully placing her bag in the overhead compartment. With the ease of someone well-practiced in travel etiquette, she settled into her seat, smoothing the fabric of her dress as she did so. Ava was not one to lounge or appear idle. She preferred to remain engaged. Even in transit, without hesitation, she retrieved a small notebook and pen from her bag, flipping it open to a blank page before beginning to write. Her pen moved fluidly across the paper, the rhythmic strokes a reflection of her focused mind. Occasionally, she would pause, tapping the pen lightly against the edge of the page, deep in thought. This was a habit of hers, using travel time to brainstorm, jot down ideas, or refine plans. Today was no exception. Despite the hum of activity around her, the murmured conversations of other passengers, the rustling of newspapers, the occasional clinking of glasses as the flight attendants moved through the cabin, Ava remained undisturbed. She had a way of tuning out distractions, creating an invisible barrier between herself and the world when she needed to concentrate. Even when she felt the weight of curious glances from those around her, she didn't flinch. It wasn't arrogance or aloofness, rather, it was an unshakable confidence. The kind that came from years of navigating spaces where she was sometimes seen as an outsider but never allowed herself to be treated as one. To an outside observer, Ava's demeanor was effortless, as if she had stepped onto this flight without a single worry. But beneath the surface, she carried a quiet determination, a self-assurance that had been cultivated through experience. She had worked hard to be where she was in life, and she carried herself accordingly. There was no nervousness in her posture, no uncertainty in her expression. Even when a flight attendant passed by and momentarily hesitated while glancing at her seat, Ava didn't react. She simply continued writing, her pen gliding smoothly over the page. She had nothing to prove, nothing to justify. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, though she was unaware of it at the time. This flight would soon take an unexpected turn, one that would challenge her composure in ways she hadn't anticipated. But for now, Ava remained steady, poised, and completely in control of her environment. The world around her could shift. Opinions could form and change. But one thing remained certain. Ava Carter was a woman who knew her worth. And nothing, not even the unexpected, could shake that foundation. Miranda Scott moved through the first-class cabin with the sharp precision of a seasoned flight attendant. Her uniform was immaculate, her posture rigidly upright, and her eyes keenly scanning every row as she performed her usual pre-flight checks. She prided herself on her ability to assess passengers quickly, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, and to maintain order with a firm but professional demeanor. It was an instinct she had developed over the years, a mixture of experience and gut feelings that told her who belonged and who didn't. So, when her gaze landed on Ava Carter, comfortably seated in first class with her notebook open, pen moving methodically across the page, something made Miranda pause. She wasn't entirely sure what it was at first, perhaps the calm self-assurance in Ava's posture or the way she seemed so unfazed by the first-class luxury. But there was something about her, something that made Miranda's brows knit together in the faintest frown. She had encountered all kinds of passengers in first class before: business executives, politicians, celebrities, and old money elites, but Ava didn't fit neatly into any of those categories. She looked young, successful, confident, But there was a part of Miranda that couldn't shake the feeling that Ava was out of place. And that feeling, however unfounded, began to fester. Miranda continued moving down the aisle, but her mind kept circling back to Ava. Something wasn't adding up. She had never seen Ava before, not that she was expected to recognize every first-class passenger. But she knew the regulars. The ones who always booked premium seats with the airline. Ava wasn't one of them. And unlike the other first-class passengers, who either buried themselves in their laptops or struck up casual conversations with their seatmates, Ava sat alone in her thoughts, completely unbothered by her surroundings. There was no visible display of wealth, no designer handbag perched on her lap, no extravagant jewelry catching the cabin lights. She was polished but understated, professional but not overtly corporate. That alone wasn't unusual, but coupled with Miranda's growing unease, it was enough for her to act on instinct. Without fully realizing she had made the decision, she turned on her heel and headed back toward Ava's seat, her grip tightening around the flight manifest in her hand. Standing just beside Ava's row, Miranda leaned in slightly, schooling her expression into one of polite authority. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the well-rehearsed tone of firm professionalism. "Can I see your boarding pass, please?" The request was framed as routine, but there was an unmistakable edge to it, one that Ava immediately picked up on. Looking up from her notes, Ava met Miranda's gaze with a calm, steady expression. She blinked once, then nodded, slipping her hand into her blazer pocket and retrieving the crisp boarding pass. Without hesitation, she handed it over, her fingers brushing lightly against Miranda's as she did. "Of course," Ava said simply, her voice smooth and unwavering. Miranda barely glanced at Ava's face as she took the boarding pass, her eyes scanning the ticket instead. She expected, perhaps even hoped, to find some discrepancy, some mistake that justified her suspicion. But there was none. The seat number was correct. The first-class designation was clearly marked. The ticket was fully paid and confirmed. There was nothing, absolutely nothing, to suggest that Ava didn't belong exactly where she was sitting. And yet, as Miranda handed the ticket back, her expression remained tight, as if she were trying to reconcile something in her mind that logic refused to support. "Thank you," she said curtly, straightening up. Without another word, she turned and walked away. But the tension in her shoulders betrayed her lingering doubt. As she made her way toward the galley, Miranda's thoughts continued to churn. If the ticket was valid, then why did she still feel uneasy? She had no real answer. Only the nagging feeling that she had missed something. Instinct told her that there was more to this passenger than what was printed on the boarding pass. And Miranda had never been one to ignore her instincts. Near the front of the cabin, she spotted another flight attendant, a younger woman named Clara, arranging refreshments on a tray. Without thinking, Miranda pulled her aside, keeping her voice low. "See that woman in 3A?" she asked, subtly nodding toward Ava's seat. Clara followed her gaze, her brow furrowing slightly. "Yes, what about her?" Miranda hesitated, debating how much to say. "Something seems off," she muttered finally, crossing her arms. "I just have a feeling she shouldn't be in first class." Clara blinked, tilting her head slightly in confusion. "But she has a valid ticket, doesn't she?" she asked. Miranda exhaled sharply through her nose. "Yes, but," she paused, searching for the right words. "I don't know. She doesn't seem like the usual first-class type." Clara's frown deepened. "What does that mean?" she asked carefully. For the first time, Miranda realized she had no real justification. Ava hadn't done anything suspicious. She hadn't acted out of line, hadn't been rude, hadn't broken a single rule. And yet, Miranda couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. But what was she basing that on? The way Ava carried herself? The fact that she didn't seem to fit Miranda's unspoken expectations of a first-class passenger? The realization was an uncomfortable one, but Miranda pushed it aside, unwilling to question herself too deeply. Instead, she squared her shoulders and made a decision. "I need to double-check something," she said, brushing past Clara without waiting for a response. Minutes later, Miranda was back at Ava's seat, her polite veneer now laced with unmistakable authority. "Miss Carter," she said, her tone firmer this time. "Can you step aside for a moment? I need to verify something with your booking." Ava raised an eyebrow, But if she was surprised by the renewed scrutiny, she didn't show it. She nodded once, quietly gathering her belongings before standing. The first-class cabin, once a space of hushed conversations and polite indifference, now felt charged with a new tension. Other passengers exchanged curious glances, whispering among themselves, sensing that something was unfolding. Ava walked toward the galley with quiet poise, but Miranda could feel the weight of the stairs pressing against her back. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crept into her mind, but she brushed it away. She was doing her job. She was ensuring that first class remained reserved for those who truly belonged. And yet, as Ava stood calmly in the narrow space near the galley, her expression unreadable, Miranda couldn't shake the growing discomfort curling in her gut. Something about this woman unsettled her, not because of anything Ava had done, but because of what Miranda had assumed. But it was too late to turn back now. The wheels were already in motion, and Miranda was determined to follow through, convinced that she was right, whether or not the facts supported her suspicion. Ava Carter had never been one to cause a scene, but as she stood in the narrow space near the galley, she was acutely aware of the many eyes watching her. The murmurs in the first-class cabin had grown louder, and though no one spoke directly to her, she could feel their curiosity pressing in on her like a heavy weight. Miranda Scott, the flight attendant who had pulled her aside, stood stiffly in front of her, arms crossed tightly over her chest, exuding an air of forced authority. Ava had done nothing wrong, yet the way Miranda had framed the situation, using vague terms like verification and mistake, made it seem as though she had been caught in some kind of wrongdoing. A few first-class passengers exchanged puzzled glances, some shaking their heads in confusion. Others, however, averted their eyes, choosing not to engage, as though unwilling to involve themselves in a moment of quiet injustice. Ava remained composed, her chin held high as she calmly responded to Miranda's request. "I don't understand," she said, her voice level but firm. "My ticket was confirmed. What exactly needs to be verified?" She was not confrontational, but neither was she passive. She had paid for this seat like anyone else in first class, and she was entitled to a clear answer. Miranda, however, did not seem concerned with providing one. Instead, she exhaled sharply, as though Ava's mere questioning was an inconvenience. "It appears there was an issue with your booking," Miranda said curtly, avoiding Ava's gaze. "I'm going to have to ask you to move to the main cabin while we sort this out." The words landed like a slap, their impact amplified by the audience around them. The whispers in the cabin grew louder, and Ava could feel the weight of their judgment, though not all of it was directed at her. Some passengers seemed surprised by Miranda's insistence, and at least one woman murmured something that sounded like, "That doesn't seem right," but no one spoke up. No one questioned Miranda's decision outright. The flight attendants were in charge, and most people on board had no desire to challenge them. Ava's fingers tightened around the strap of her laptop bag. She knew exactly what was happening. She had seen it before, had even experienced it in subtler ways throughout her life, but never so publicly, never with such deliberate humiliation. "I don't believe there is a mistake," Ava said, her voice measured, but there was an unmistakable edge to it now. "I booked this seat weeks ago. It was confirmed. I checked in without any issue. And now, suddenly, there's a problem?" Miranda's expression darkened slightly, but her tone remained rigidly polite. "Miss Carter, I'm asking you to take a seat in the main cabin. If you refuse, I'll have to call security to assist." There it was, the unspoken threat. Ava could feel her heart begin to beat harder in her chest. Though outwardly, she remained impassive, Miranda had given her an impossible choice. Either she could escalate the situation, drawing even more attention and creating a scene that Miranda would undoubtedly frame as Ava being difficult, or she could comply, allowing herself to be removed from her rightful seat in an act of public degradation. It was a calculated move, one meant to make Ava feel powerless. But Ava was not powerless. She inhaled slowly, her mind racing even as her expression remained controlled. She knew that the moment she stood up and walked to economy class, she would be making a statement, not just about herself, but about what Miranda believed to be true, that she didn't belong here. That first class was not meant for someone like her. And the worst part? Most of the people watching wouldn't even realize what they had witnessed. To them, it might seem like a simple mistake, an ordinary airline mix-up, but to Ava, it was something much bigger. Without another word, she reached for her bag and straightened her shoulders. If Miranda thought she could strip her of her dignity, she was wrong. Ava would not argue, nor would she let Miranda see the anger that simmered beneath her surface. Instead, she turned with quiet grace and walked back toward the economy section. Her movements unhurried, her posture as regal as ever. As she passed through the first-class cabin, she felt the weight of the passengers' stares, some openly watching, others pretending to be engrossed in their tablets or books. The walk to economy felt longer than it should have. When she arrived at the designated seat, a cramped middle-row spot, Miranda gestured dismissively. As if the matter were now settled. "You can place your bag under the seat," she said flatly before turning on her heel and walking away without another glance. Ava carefully slid her bag into place and sat down, ignoring the curious looks from the passengers around her. She knew what some of them were thinking. What happened? Why was she moved? But no one asked. No one wanted to get involved. As she settled into her new seat, she let her hands rest on her lap, her expression giving nothing away. She would not fidget, would not sigh in frustration, would not let anyone see the storm brewing inside her. Instead, she reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and began typing a message with practiced efficiency. A few passengers nearby might have assumed she was texting a friend to vent. But they would be wrong. Ava wasn't sending a message of complaint. She was taking the first step in correcting this injustice. After hitting send, she placed her phone down with the faintest smile tugging at the corner of her lips. She had seen this game before, and she knew exactly how to play it. Miranda Scott thought she had won, thought she had put Ava in her place. But what she didn't know was that Ava had no intention of letting this go. This wasn't about a single flight or one rude flight attendant. It was about something much larger, something that went beyond the narrow confines of this airplane cabin. And Miranda was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The hum of the plane's engines filled the cabin, masking the subtle tension that still lingered in the air. Ava leaned back in her seat, her eyes focused but unreadable. She had been humiliated in front of an entire first-class cabin, stripped of her rightful place without reason. But she would not let that humiliation define her. If anything, it had only strengthened her resolve. Because while Miranda might have had control in this moment, the flight was far from over. And by the time they landed, Ava would make sure that Miranda regretted ever thinking she had the power to determine who did and did not belong. Ava Carter sat in her newly assigned economy class seat, her back straight and her expression composed. Though beneath the surface, her mind was already working. She had spent years navigating spaces where she wasn't always welcomed, where silent assumptions were made about who she was and where she belonged. This was not new to her. What was new was the sheer audacity of it, the public nature of the humiliation. The cold dismissal, the unspoken but obvious reasoning behind Miranda Scott's decision to remove her from first class. Ava had learned long ago that the best response to injustice was not always immediate outrage but calculated action. She was not the kind of person to cause a scene or demand attention through loud protests. Instead, she operated with precision. She preferred strategy over chaos, patience over rashness, and right now, she was already setting her plan into motion. Reaching into her bag, she pulled out her phone and swiftly unlocked it. Her fingers moved effortlessly over the screen as she navigated through her contacts, finding the one she needed. The name was simple, Daniel Foster, but the weight it carried was significant. He was not just anyone, he was an executive at the airline. Someone with real power to make decisions. And, more importantly, someone who owed Ava a favor. She had no intention of escalating the matter in a way that would disrupt the flight. But she also had no intention of letting this moment pass unnoticed. With a quiet confidence, she typed out a message. "I need a favor. I'm on flight 287, and there's been an incident. No need to escalate yet, just watch for my signal." She reread the message once, ensuring its tone remained professional yet firm. Before hitting send, almost immediately, the message was marked as read. That was all Ava needed for now. She knew Daniel well enough to trust that he would handle the situation discreetly but effectively. With that step completed, she locked her phone and placed it back in her bag, then turned her attention to the window. From the outside, She appeared completely unbothered, as though she had merely accepted her new seat assignment and moved on. But inside, she was fully engaged in the unfolding events, carefully considering every possible outcome. She understood the importance of perception, how people read body language, how they interpreted responses. If she had made a scene earlier, Miranda would have spun the situation against her, claiming she was being disruptive. But by handling it with quiet dignity, Ava had done something far more powerful. She had drawn attention to the injustice without uttering a single word. She could already feel the shift in the cabin. The murmurs had not stopped. Other passengers had witnessed what happened, and while most chose to remain silent, some couldn't help but glance in her direction, their expressions ranging from confusion to discomfort. One man across the aisle leaned slightly toward her, lowering his voice as he spoke. "That was strange," he said. "You had a first-class ticket, didn't you?" Ava turned to face him, offering a small, composed smile. "I did," she replied simply. The man frowned. "That flight attendant, Miranda?" She seemed off about it, like she had already decided you didn't belong there before even checking. Ava held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. "It's not the first time something like this has happened," she admitted, "but it might be the last time it happens on this airline." The man's eyebrows lifted slightly, intrigued by her calm confidence. He seemed to want to ask more, but Ava turned back to the window, effectively ending the conversation. She wasn't interested in gaining sympathy. She was interested in action. Meanwhile, in the first-class cabin, Miranda Scott continued with her duties, checking on passengers and ensuring drinks were served with practiced efficiency. But no matter how much she tried to focus on her tasks, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling of unease that had settled in her stomach. Ava's quiet compliance had been unsettling. Miranda had expected at least some resistance, perhaps a heated exchange, an indignant protest. Instead, Ava had simply gathered her belongings and moved, her face unreadable, and that, more than anything, made Miranda feel like she had miscalculated. At the front of the plane, the flight attendant's communication system buzzed softly. One of the senior crew members, Dennis, picked up the call. "Cabin crew," he answered in a professional tone. The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "This is the airline's executive office. We've received a direct complaint regarding a first-class passenger. We need a full account of the situation upon landing." Dennis's expression shifted slightly as he listened, his gaze flickering toward Miranda, who was now preparing a tray of beverages. "Understood," he said, keeping his voice neutral. When the call ended, he placed the phone down and walked over to Miranda. "You need to tread carefully," he warned her in a low voice. "I just got word from the executive office. They're looking into whatever happened with that woman you moved." Miranda stiffened. "I didn't do anything wrong," she insisted, but there was a slight tremor in her voice. Dennis sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "That's not the point. You removed a first-class passenger from her paid seat. And I don't know who she is. But I can tell you this, she has enough influence to get corporate involved mid-flight." Miranda's mouth went dry. She glanced toward the economy section, where Ava sat quietly, her expression unreadable. Suddenly, she felt something close to panic creeping in. Had she just made the biggest mistake of her career? Ava, on the other hand, remained unshaken. She knew the game was shifting in her favor. She leaned back in her seat and pulled out her notebook again, flipping it open to a fresh page. Her pen hovered over the paper for a brief moment before she began to write, her thoughts as sharp and methodical as ever. She had set the wheels in motion, and now, all she had to do was wait. 7 minutes later, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'd like to thank you for flying with us today. If there is anything you need, please don't hesitate to let our crew know." Ava's eyes flicked toward the front of the plane, her expression impassive. She knew it was only a matter of time before the airline took action. She had been through enough battles to recognize when she had already won. And as the plane cruised steadily at 30,000 feet, she allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Miranda had thought she could remove Ava from her seat and move on as if nothing had happened. What she didn't realize was that Ava wasn't just any passenger. She was a woman who understood power, strategy, and the importance of patience. And by the time they landed, Miranda would understand exactly what that meant. Miranda Scott moved through the first-class cabin with a newfound sense of satisfaction. Believing that she had handled the situation with authority and efficiency, she felt a small, fleeting surge of victory as she placed a drink in front of a passenger. Her professional smile firmly in place. In her mind, the issue was resolved. Ava Carter had been relocated to the main cabin. And order had been restored. It wasn't personal, Miranda reassured herself. It was simply a matter of ensuring that first class remained a space for the right kind of passengers. The thought provided her with a sense of justification, quelling the tiny voice of doubt that threatened to creep in. But despite her attempt to move on, something about Ava's calm compliance unsettled her. Usually, when passengers were asked to move, there was resistance, a heated exchange, a moment of frustration, perhaps even a demand to speak to a supervisor. But Ava had done none of that. She had quietly gathered her belongings and walked to economy with the kind of composure that left Miranda feeling oddly exposed. As if she had just made a move in a game she didn't even know she was playing. Still, Miranda brushed away the unease. Forcing herself to focus on her routine, she moved up and down the aisle, refilling glasses, adjusting blankets, and ensuring that the first-class passengers were comfortable. Occasionally, her eyes flickered toward the economy cabin, but she quickly dismissed any lingering concerns. Ava Carter was just another passenger. She had been reassigned, and that was that. The airline had procedures, and Miranda had followed them, at least. That's what she told herself. But even as she tried to settle into her usual rhythm, a creeping sensation of doubt gnawed at the edges of her mind. She told herself she had made the right call, that her instincts had been correct. But why did she feel so uneasy? Meanwhile, Ava sat quietly in her new economy class seat, her posture relaxed yet purposeful. She wasn't rattled, nor was she dwelling on the insult of being removed from first class. Instead, she was already orchestrating the next steps. She had handled far more complex situations in boardrooms and negotiations. This was no different. If Miranda had expected her to react emotionally, to argue or make a scene, she had miscalculated. Ava had a different approach, one that was far more effective. She had sent her message, and now all she had to do was wait. Back in first class, Miranda exchanged a few words with her fellow flight attendants, forcing a lightness into her tone as if nothing unusual had happened. Dennis, the senior flight attendant, observed her with a raised eyebrow, sensing that something was off. He had worked in the industry long enough to recognize when a colleague was overcompensating. "You seem tense," he commented casually as he prepared a tray of drinks. Miranda scoffed lightly. "Not at all," she replied quickly, almost too quickly. "Just another day on the job." Dennis studied her for a moment, then shrugged, but the way he glanced toward the economy section did not go unnoticed by Miranda. The minutes ticked by, and Miranda tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in her chest. But then, the quiet buzz of the in-flight phone in the galley made her stomach drop. It was rare for calls to come through mid-flight unless something urgent had occurred. Dennis picked up the receiver, nodding slightly as he listened. Then, without a word, he extended the phone toward Miranda, his expression unreadable. "It's for you," he said simply. "They're asking for you by name." Miranda hesitated, her fingers tightening around the tray she had been holding. There was something ominous about the way Dennis looked at her, as if he already knew this call wasn't going to be in her favor. Slowly, she set the tray down and took the phone, pressing it to her ear. "This is Miranda," she said, her voice carefully controlled. The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "This is the airline's executive office. We've received a direct complaint regarding an incident involving a first-class passenger on your flight. We need you to provide a detailed report upon landing. For now, ensure all passengers are treated respectfully and refrain from altering any further seating arrangements without proper justification." Miranda's breath hitched slightly. A direct complaint? That was unusual. Typically, if a passenger had an issue, it would be handled through standard channels, not escalated in real time. Her grip on the phone tightened. "Understood," she managed to say, her throat suddenly dry. "I'll make sure everything is handled appropriately." As she hung up, her mind raced. Who had filed the complaint? Had Ava spoken to someone already? Or worse, had she contacted someone with influence? A sinking feeling settled in Miranda's stomach. She glanced toward the economy cabin again, her gaze landing on Ava, who remained seated, seemingly unbothered. She wasn't on the phone. She wasn't arguing with anyone. She was simply sitting there, her expression unreadable, as if she had known all along that this would happen. Dennis leaned against the counter, watching Miranda with mild curiosity. "Everything okay?" he asked. Miranda forced a tight-lipped smile. "Everything's fine," she lied, but even as she said it, she knew it wasn't. The complaint had already reached the executive office, and that meant this wasn't going to simply disappear when the flight landed. Ava Carter was not just another passenger. She was someone with connections, someone who understood exactly how to handle situations like this, and Miranda had walked right into it without even realizing. As she moved back through the first-class cabin, her steps felt heavier. The feeling of victory she had clung to earlier was slipping away, replaced with a gnawing sense of dread. She had assumed that her authority was final, that once she had relocated Ava, the matter was settled, but now, she saw her mistake. Ava had never lost control of the situation. If anything, she had merely stepped back, allowing Miranda to dig herself deeper into a hole of her own making. Miranda took a deep breath, adjusting the cuffs of her uniform as she approached a passenger who had requested another drink. She needed to regain control, at least of herself. But no matter how much she tried to focus, the knowledge of that phone call lingered in the back of her mind. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, and for the first time, she realized she might have severely underestimated Ava Carter. Meanwhile, back in the economy cabin, Ava glanced at her phone as it vibrated softly in her lap. She unlocked the screen and read the short, direct message from her contact at the airline. "They've been notified. We're monitoring the situation." Ava smiled subtly, her expression remaining composed. Miranda believed she had won, but in reality, the game had only just begun. Ava had played her role perfectly, remaining calm, allowing the mistake to unfold in full view, and ensuring that the right people were watching. By the time the flight landed, Miranda wouldn't be thinking about victory anymore. She would be thinking about consequences, and Ava Carter would make sure of that. Ava Carter sat in her cramped economy class seat, her expression unreadable as she gazed out of the window. To any casual observer, she appeared unaffected by what had just transpired, just another passenger quietly enduring the discomfort of a long flight. But inside, she was already 3 steps ahead. She had sent her message, and now she waited, knowing full well that the wheels were already turning behind the scenes. Ava was not someone who simply accepted mistreatment and moved on. She was deliberate, strategic, and well-connected, and while Miranda Scott may have thought she had the final say in the situation, she was about to realize just how mistaken she had been. Ava's phone vibrated softly in her lap, a subtle but significant sign that her network was already at work. Without drawing attention to herself, she unlocked the screen and glanced at the incoming message. Noted, "We're monitoring. Expect a call soon." A slow, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corners of her lips before vanishing just as quickly. She placed the phone back into her bag and leaned back in her seat, maintaining her poised, composed demeanor. She wasn't one for theatrics, nor did she need to announce her influence. The right people already knew, and that was enough. Meanwhile, in the first-class cabin, Miranda Scott was beginning to feel the first pangs of regret. She had convinced herself that she had handled the situation appropriately, that Ava's removal had been justified, even if she couldn't quite articulate why. But something about the way Ava had complied, the way she had walked to the economy section without protest, unsettled Miranda more than any argument would have. There had been no anger, no demand to speak to a supervisor, no threats of escalation, and that, more than anything, made Miranda feel like she had missed something crucial. Her unease deepened when the flight's intercom system buzzed quietly, signaling an incoming call. It wasn't unusual for the flight crew to receive messages from the airline's operations center, but something about the timing felt off. Dennis, the senior flight attendant, picked up the phone, his expression neutral as he listened. Then, after a few moments, his eyes flickered toward Miranda. Without a word, he extended the phone toward her. "It's for you," he said, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of curiosity. "They're asking for you by name." Miranda hesitated before taking the receiver. "This is Miranda," she said, forcing a polite but professional tone. The voice on the other end was calm but authoritative. This is the airline's executive office. We've received a direct complaint regarding a first-class passenger on your flight. The matter has already been flagged for review. We need you to provide a full account of the incident upon landing. There was a slight pause before the voice continued. And for the remainder of the flight, ensure that all passengers are treated with the utmost respect. That includes Miss Carter. Miranda's stomach dropped. Miss Carter. The name was suddenly weighted with significance. She had assumed Ava was just another passenger. Someone who might file a complaint that would eventually get lost in the system. But the fact that the executive office was already involved mid-flight meant something entirely different. This wasn't just any passenger. Ava Carter was someone important. Someone powerful. And Miranda had just made the kind of mistake that couldn't be undone. She swallowed hard, gripping the phone tighter. Yes, of course, she managed to say. I'll make sure everything is handled properly. The line clicked off, leaving Miranda standing there, her mind racing. She turned to Dennis, who was watching her with mild curiosity. What was that about? He asked. Miranda forced a smile, though it felt brittle. Just a routine follow-up, she lied. Dennis didn't seem convinced, but he didn't press further. You should be careful, he said instead, his voice carrying the weight of experience. First-class passengers tend to have connections. If you bumped someone who wasn't supposed to be bumped, this could turn into a much bigger problem than you realize. Miranda nodded stiffly, but the truth was already settling in her gut like a heavy stone. She had assumed too much. She had let her instincts guide her. And now she was paying the price. Back in the economy cabin, Ava remained the picture of composure. Though she could sense the shift in energy. She knew the moment Miranda received that phone call. She didn't need to see it to know it had happened. It was in the way the first-class cabin had gone slightly quieter. In the way the flight attendants now seemed more aware of her presence. It was in the way Clara, the younger flight attendant who had shown her kindness earlier, now approached with renewed urgency. Miss Carter, Clara said softly, her voice laced with concern. Can I get you anything? Another drink? A blanket? Ava looked up, offering a warm but knowing smile. I'm fine, Clara, she said, her voice steady, but thank you for asking. Clara hesitated as if she wanted to say more, but instead, she nodded and walked away. Ava could tell she had sensed it too, that unspoken shift in power. The silent realization that something was happening beyond what the passengers could see. Miranda, on the other hand, was now trying desperately to suppress her growing panic. She busied herself with small tasks, refilling drinks, straightening napkins, anything to keep herself from thinking about what awaited her when the plane landed. But no matter how much she tried to ignore it, the truth was undeniable. Ava Carter was someone she should never have underestimated. As the flight continued, Ava reached for her phone once more. A new message had appeared. They'll call again soon. Let me know if you need anything further. Ava typed a short response. No need. They'll handle it. Then, placing her phone back into her bag, she returned her gaze to the window, watching as the clouds stretched endlessly before her. She didn't need to make another move. She had already won. Miranda just didn't know it yet. Miranda Scott had always considered herself a competent flight attendant. She knew the rules, followed protocol, and handled difficult passengers with practiced ease. But as she moved through the first-class cabin, pretending to go about her duties, a strange unease had settled in her chest, tightening with each passing moment. She had expected the situation with Ava Carter to be over the moment she had escorted her to economy. First class had returned to its usual hum of quiet conversations and clinking glasses. Yet Miranda couldn't shake the sense that something was deeply wrong. The phone call from the airline's executive office had been her first warning. A crack in her illusion of control. But it was Ava's unsettling calm that truly gnawed at her. There had been no argument, no protest, no demand to speak to a supervisor. Instead, Ava had simply stood, collected her belongings, and walked away, her head held high. It wasn't the reaction of someone who had been defeated, it was the reaction of someone who knew she had already won. And that realization sent a chill down Miranda's spine. She tried to push away the unease, focusing instead on the passengers in first class. She forced a polite smile as she refilled drinks. engaging in brief, pleasant conversations, but her hands weren't as steady as they usually were. Her movements felt robotic, her mind stuck in an endless loop, replaying every moment of her interaction with Ava. Had she miscalculated? Had she crossed a line? At the time, she had been so sure she was making the right decision. After all, she had followed her instincts, just as she always did. But now, those same instincts were betraying her, whispering that she had made a mistake, one she couldn't take back. Dennis, the senior flight attendant, watched her with quiet scrutiny as she handed a drink to a passenger. "You okay?" he asked casually, but there was an edge to his voice, a hint that he had noticed her change in demeanor. Miranda nodded quickly. "Of course, why wouldn't I be?" she replied, forcing lightness into her tone. Dennis gave a noncommittal shrug. "No reason," he said, but the way he lingered suggested otherwise. "Just seems like you've been tense since that phone call." Miranda stiffened. "It was just a routine inquiry," she said dismissively. "Nothing to worry about." Dennis didn't push further, but his expression remained unreadable as he returned to his duties. Miranda turned away, exhaling slowly. She needed to get a grip. She had handled situations like this before, passengers who complained, who demanded compensation, who exaggerated the smallest inconveniences. But this felt different. There was an unpredictability to it that unsettled her, a sense that the ground beneath her was shifting, and she didn't know how to steady herself. She glanced toward the economy cabin, her eyes searching for Ava. She spotted her seated by the window, still composed, still unbothered. Ava wasn't scrolling through her phone, wasn't whispering to another passenger about what had happened. She was simply sitting there, waiting. Miranda's stomach twisted. What was she waiting for? As if on cue, the galley phone rang again, and this time, Miranda felt a prickle of sweat at the back of her neck. She turned toward the front of the plane, hesitating before answering. For a split second, she considered ignoring it, letting someone else take the call. But she knew she couldn't avoid it forever. Taking a steadying breath, she picked up the receiver. "This is Miranda," she said, keeping her voice as professional as possible. The voice on the other end was different this time, calmer but firmer. "Miss Scott, this is Captain Harris. We've received an additional inquiry from the executive office regarding Miss Carter. I need to speak with you in the cockpit immediately." Miranda's throat went dry. "The captain? Why would the captain need to speak to me?" "Understood," she managed to say, though her voice came out slightly weaker than intended. She placed the phone back down and turned, her breath shallow. Dennis, who had been standing nearby, gave her a sharp look. "Now the captain's involved?" he muttered under his breath. "I told you. You should have left that woman alone." Miranda didn't reply. Instead, she forced herself toward the front of the plane, her pulse hammering with every step. The door to the cockpit opened, and Captain Harris, a middle-aged man with a commanding presence, turned to face her. His expression was unreadable, but the tightness in his jaw made her uneasy. "Miss Scott," he began, his voice measured, "I'm going to be direct with you. The passenger you removed from first class, Miss Carter, is not just any passenger. She has ties to the airline's board of directors." Miranda's heart nearly stopped. I didn't know," she stammered, her hands suddenly clammy. The captain's gaze sharpened. "That's exactly the problem. You acted without cause. Miss Carter's ticket was fully valid. There was no reason to remove her. And now, we have a serious issue on our hands." Miranda's mind reeled. "Sir, you thought wrong," the captain interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "This is no longer a minor incident. You've drawn the attention of the board, and they will be reviewing your actions closely. When we land, you will provide a full report. Until then, do not approach Miss Carter. Do not attempt to justify what happened. And do not make this situation worse than it already is." Miranda swallowed hard. "Yes, sir," she whispered. The captain studied her for a moment before nodding toward the door. "Return to your duties." Miranda turned and stepped out of the cockpit, but her legs felt unsteady. The anxiety that had been simmering beneath the surface now boiled over, spreading through her like wildfire. She had miscalculated, badly. Ava Carter wasn't just a passenger. She was someone with influence. Someone who had the power to decide whether Miranda still had a job by the time this flight was over. She returned to the galley, gripping the counter to steady herself. Dennis watched her carefully, not looking so confident anymore. He observed. Miranda clenched her jaw. "Don't start," she muttered. Dennis sighed, shaking his head. "I warned you." Miranda barely heard him. Her mind was spinning too fast. Filled with panic and regret. She had thought she was in control. She had thought she had won. But now, as the plane continued its journey toward its destination, she realized the truth. She had been playing a game without knowing the rules. And Ava Carter? She had been playing to win all along. Miranda Scott had never felt so small in her career. As she stepped out of the cockpit and into the narrow galley, her legs felt like lead, her hands clammy despite the cool air circulating through the cabin. The captain's words still echoed in her head, each one landing like a heavy blow. "You acted without cause. You've drawn the attention of the board. The airline is watching." She had gone from feeling victorious over a minor inconvenience, a passenger she assumed didn't belong, to realizing she had just made the gravest mistake of her professional life. And now, there was no way to undo what had already been set into motion. She leaned against the counter, inhaling deeply in an attempt to steady herself. Dennis, the senior flight attendant, stood nearby, watching her with the kind of expression that was part curiosity, part disapproval. "You look like you just saw a ghost," he muttered, reaching for a tray of drinks. Miranda shot him a sharp glance but said nothing. She wasn't about to explain what had just happened behind the closed doors of the cockpit. She knew he already had a good guess. And worse, she knew he had been right all along. Dennis, of course, wasn't going to let her off that easily. "Let me guess," he continued, keeping his voice low as he poured coffee into a first-class passenger's cup. "The captain just ripped into you about our VIP guest in economy?" Miranda swallowed hard, her jaw tightening. "It's none of your concern," she snapped, though the words lacked the bite she intended. Dennis let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "See, that's where you're wrong. When someone on this plane makes a mistake that gets the executive office involved mid-flight, it becomes all of our concern." He set the coffee pot down and fixed her with a knowing look. "You didn't just bump a passenger. You bumped the wrong passenger. And now, you're feeling it." Miranda exhaled sharply, forcing herself to stand up straighter. "I didn't know she had ties to the board," she hissed under her breath, lowering her voice so nearby passengers wouldn't overhear. Dennis raised an eyebrow. "Would it have mattered if you did?" Miranda opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out, because the truth was, deep down, she knew she had made the decision to remove Ava based on an assumption, not on facts. Not on policy, but on a feeling that had betrayed her. And now, the captain had made it painfully clear that she had no more room for mistakes. She clenched her hands into fists and turned away from Dennis, returning to her duties with stiff, robotic movements. She needed to keep herself busy, needed to avoid the creeping dread that was building in her chest. The flight wasn't even halfway over, and she was already counting down the minutes until landing, until she could sit down and figure out how to salvage this disaster. In the economy cabin, Ava Carter remained composed, though she was fully aware of the shift in atmosphere. She had seen the way Miranda had hurried out of the cockpit. Her usually confident stride replaced with something tighter, more cautious. She knew the moment the captain had spoken to Miranda, knew that her message, delivered through the right channels, had already started taking effect. She didn't gloat, she didn't smirk or revel in the silent victory. Instead, she remained calm, her expression neutral as she flipped through a book she had pulled from her bag. This was not about personal revenge. It never had been. It was about accountability, about making sure that people like Miranda understood that their decisions had consequences. Her phone vibrated lightly in her lap. Without drawing attention to herself, she glanced at the screen. A new message from Daniel Foster, her contact at the airline's corporate office. "They've been informed. The captain has given direct orders. She won't be bothering you again." Ava allowed herself the smallest nod before locking her phone and slipping it back into her bag. She had expected as much. The airline wouldn't want to risk upsetting someone with her level of influence. But that wasn't enough. She wanted to make sure that this never happened again, not just to her, but to anyone who found themselves in a similar situation. From across the aisle, A man who had been seated near her since the start of the flight leaned slightly toward her. He had seen what had happened earlier, had watched her be escorted out of first class for no reason other than Miranda's assumption. "Excuse me," he said, keeping his voice low. "I don't mean to pry, but I saw what happened earlier. That flight attendant, she was way out of line." Ava looked at him, her expression still poised but with a warmth that made him feel at ease. "I appreciate that," she said simply. The man hesitated before continuing. "I've flown a lot. First class, economy, all over. I've seen things like that happen before, but I've never seen someone handle it the way you did." Ava tilted her head slightly. "And how is that?" The man gave a small chuckle. "Like you knew exactly how this was going to end before it even started." Ava smiled faintly, but didn't reply. Meanwhile, Miranda made her way back through the first-class cabin. Her steps measured, her hands tightening around the tray she carried. She could feel the weight of her mistake pressing down on her, suffocating her. The knowledge that she was being watched, by the captain, by the airline, by Ava herself, was unbearable. She had been given a direct order, and that meant her fate was no longer in her hands. For the rest of the flight, she was to avoid Ava Carter. She was to treat every passenger with the utmost respect. And when they landed, she would have to face the consequences of her actions. A wave of nausea rolled over her. The worst part? She still didn't know just how deep Ava's connections went. All she knew was that she had made a decision she couldn't take back. And now, she was powerless to stop what was coming. Miranda Scott had never felt more humiliated in her life. As she stood in the narrow aisle of the economy cabin, clutching a glass of sparkling water on a tray, her hands trembled slightly. She was a seasoned flight attendant, accustomed to handling difficult passengers, long hours, and high-pressure situations. But this was different. This wasn't a routine service request or an entitled first-class passenger demanding special treatment. This was an apology, a forced one, a direct order from the captain, spurred by a call from the airline's executive office. She had no choice but to comply. And the worst part? She had to apologize to Ava Carter, the very woman she had removed from first class only an hour earlier. The same woman whose calm, unbothered demeanor now made Miranda feel completely exposed. Taking a deep breath, Miranda stepped forward, her usual confidence stripped away. She stopped beside Ava's seat, where the woman sat with perfect composure, a quiet authority radiating from her. Ava had barely acknowledged Miranda's presence since being relocated, making no scene, asking for nothing, yet somehow controlling everything. Miranda swallowed hard, forcing herself to maintain the professionalism that had carried her through her career. But this time, it wasn't her authority she was enforcing, it was her mistake she was trying to fix. "Miss Carter," Miranda began, her voice softer than anyone on the flight had ever heard it. She cleared her throat, forcing a polite but uncomfortable smile. "I wanted to personally apologize for any inconvenience you may have experienced earlier. There was a misunderstanding on my part." The words felt unnatural as they left her mouth, each syllable laced with the bitter taste of regret. Ava looked up from her notebook, her sharp, knowing eyes locking onto Miranda's with a patience that somehow made the moment even more unbearable. She didn't speak right away, instead letting the silence stretch just long enough to make Miranda fidget slightly. Then, tilting her head slightly, Ava repeated the word with quiet curiosity. "A misunderstanding?" Miranda's forced smile faltered. The way Ava said it, as though she were genuinely considering the possibility, made Miranda realize just how flimsy her excuse sounded. It was a thin veil over the truth, and they both knew it. Miranda had made a judgment call, one she could no longer justify. She shifted uncomfortably, adjusting her grip on the tray. "Yes," Miranda said quickly, eager to move past the moment. "And I'd like to offer you this as a token of apology." She placed the glass of sparkling water on Ava's tray table, her hand unsteady. Ava glanced down at the drink, then back up at Miranda. Her expression remained unreadable, but there was a flicker of something, amusement, perhaps, in her gaze. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice measured. She picked up the glass with careful precision, studying the way the bubbles danced along the rim. Then, without taking a sip, she set it back down. "But I think it's going to take more than a drink to fix this." The words, though spoken softly, hit Miranda like a slap. She felt her face flush, her heart pounding painfully in her chest. She had expected Ava to accept the apology with polite indifference, to take the drink and allow the matter to be quietly brushed aside. Instead, Ava had made it clear, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Miranda swallowed against the dryness in her throat. Of course, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. If there's anything else I can do to make this right, please let me know. Ava studied her for a moment, as if weighing her words carefully. Then, after another deliberate pause, she smiled faintly, not a smile of victory or smugness, but one of certainty. I appreciate your effort, she said finally, but I believe the airline will address this matter appropriately after we land. Miranda's stomach sank. The mention of the airline, the clear indication that Ava had no intention of letting this slide, made her pulse race. She had assumed that the forced apology would be enough, that she could smooth over the incident and move on. But Ava wasn't interested in smoothing things over. She was interested in accountability. I understand, Miranda stammered, lowering her eyes. Please let me know if you need anything else. Ava said nothing more, instead returning her attention to her notebook as if the conversation had already ended. Miranda hesitated for a second longer, then turned and walked away, each step feeling heavier than the last. She could feel the eyes of nearby passengers on her, their curiosity and quiet judgment pressing in around her like a suffocating weight. She had been the one with the power when she removed Ava from first class. But now, the power dynamic had shifted completely. As she returned to the galley, Miranda clenched her jaw, trying to suppress the rising panic inside her. She had spent years maintaining a flawless professional record, carefully building a reputation as a competent, authoritative flight attendant, and now, all of that was unraveling before her eyes. Dennis, who had been watching the exchange from a distance, arched an eyebrow as she approached. How'd it go? He asked, his tone neutral but knowing. Miranda exhaled sharply, setting down the empty tray with more force than necessary. She's not done, she muttered, her voice laced with frustration and dread. She's going to take this all the way. Dennis sighed, shaking his head. I told you, first-class passengers don't take kindly to being bumped. And this one? She's not just any passenger. Miranda ran a hand through her hair, resisting the urge to groan in frustration. She had wanted this to be over. But it was clear now, this was only the beginning. Back in the economy cabin, Ava sat quietly, her expression as poised as ever. She reached for the glass of sparkling water, this time taking a slow, deliberate sip. The bubbles fizzed against her lips, crisp and sharp, but she barely registered the taste. Instead, her mind was already focused on what came next. She had given Miranda the chance to take responsibility, to own up to what had happened, but the flight attendant had chosen instead to offer a hollow apology, hoping that it would be enough to make the situation disappear. It wasn't. Ava glanced down at her phone as a new message appeared on the screen. We've received your statement. The board will be reviewing the incident. She locked the screen and set the phone aside, her lips curving into a subtle, knowing smile. By the time the plane landed, Miranda Scott would understand exactly what kind of mistake she had made. Miranda Scott had never felt time drag so slowly. As she moved stiffly through the first-class cabin, pretending to focus on her duties, she could feel her career unraveling one agonizing second at a time. What had started as a simple assumption, a routine decision based on instinct, had now spiraled into something far beyond her control. She had been so certain, so convinced that she was in the right when she forced Ava Carter out of her first-class seat. But now, as the weight of the airline's response pressed down on her, she realized the truth. She had made a mistake, and it was one that would cost her dearly. The captain's direct order had stripped away any illusion that she was still in control. Miranda was no longer making the decisions, she was simply waiting for the fallout. The first chime came over the intercom, signaling that the plane would begin its descent soon. Passengers began adjusting their seats, finishing their drinks, and preparing for landing. For most, it was just another routine flight coming to an end. But for Miranda, it felt like the countdown to a sentencing. She knew that the moment the wheels touched the ground, she would have to face the full weight of her actions. There would be a meeting, an inquiry, a demand for explanations, and what could she say? That she had a feeling Ava Carter didn't belong in first class? That something about her had seemed off? The justifications that had once felt so valid now crumbled under scrutiny. Dennis, the senior flight attendant, approached her near the galley, his voice low but firm. "You should start preparing for what's coming," he said, his eyes flicking toward the main cabin. "This isn't going away." Miranda shot him a glare, her patience fraying. "I know that," she snapped, but there was no conviction behind her words. Dennis sighed, crossing his arms. "Do you?" He lowered his voice, making sure no passengers overheard. "You've been in this job long enough to know how these things go. When corporate gets involved mid-flight, it's not just a slap on the wrist. They're making an example out of you." Miranda's throat tightened. "It was a misunderstanding," she muttered. "I followed protocol." Dennis shook his head. "No, you followed your own assumptions. And now, you're going to have to answer for that." He hesitated for a moment before adding, "I hope you have a plan." A plan. The words rang hollow in Miranda's mind. What plan? What could she possibly do now? The only thing left was to wait, to brace herself for what would happen next. Meanwhile, Ava Carter sat in her economy seat, her calm exterior masking the quiet storm of precision unfolding behind the scenes. She had already set things in motion, ensuring that the right people were aware of what had happened. The airline had been notified. The executive office had intervened. The captain had given a direct order. And now, all that remained was the final step, accountability. She glanced down at her phone, which vibrated softly in her lap. "They're waiting for her upon landing. Everything is in place." Ava exhaled slowly, locking the screen. It was exactly as she had anticipated. She had been in enough corporate negotiations to understand how power worked. Miranda had wielded hers recklessly, assuming she could make a snap decision without consequence. But Ava had a different kind of power, one built on patience, strategy, and connections. As the plane continued its descent, Miranda's anxiety mounted. She forced herself to go through the motions, checking seatbelts, reminding passengers to put their tray tables up, but every action felt mechanical. She could feel the stares, the quiet judgment of those who had witnessed what happened earlier. Even those who had initially ignored the situation now seemed to sense that something bigger was unfolding. By the time the plane touched down and the seatbelt sign turned off, Miranda's palms were damp with sweat. She lingered near the exit, forcing a smile as passengers filed out. But when Ava approached, their eyes met for the briefest second, and Miranda's stomach dropped. There was no malice in Ava's expression, only certainty. She wasn't angry. She wasn't smug. She was simply waiting. And that, more than anything, terrified Miranda. Then, just as Ava stepped off the plane, Miranda saw them. Two uniformed airline security officers stood at the gate, their presence subtle but unmistakable. One of them made eye contact with her, giving a small nod. "Miranda Scott?" Miranda's breath caught. "Yes," she answered hesitantly. "We need you to come with us," the officer said, his tone professional but firm. "There are some questions regarding an incident on this flight." The air felt like it had been sucked from Miranda's lungs. The passengers who were still disembarking slowed slightly, their heads turning at the unexpected development. Whispers rippled through the terminal. Miranda could feel Dennis watching from the jet bridge, his expression unreadable. She wanted to protest, to demand that this be handled privately. But she knew there was no point. The humiliation was already in motion. She had once stood in that first-class cabin, certain of her authority, certain that she was the one in control. Now, she was being led away like a disgraced employee, her future hanging by a thread. As she followed the officers, her face burning with shame, she realized the full extent of her downfall. She had underestimated Ava Carter. She had assumed that she could make an unchallenged decision, that her actions wouldn't have consequences. But Ava had played the long game, never losing her composure, never allowing herself to be rattled. And now, Miranda was the one being escorted out, while Ava walked away with her head high, already moving on to whatever came next. The walk down the terminal felt endless. Every step was a reminder of her mistake, every murmur from passing passengers another blow to her pride. And the worst part? She didn't even know what awaited her behind those closed doors. For the first time in her career, Miranda Scott felt powerless, and she hated it. Miranda Scott had always prided herself on maintaining control. For years, she had walked through terminals with confidence. Her uniform pristine, her posture upright, exuding the kind of authority that kept passengers in check. But now, as she stood just outside the jet bridge, flanked by 2 uniformed airline security officers, all of that authority had been stripped away. She could feel the curious stares of passengers passing by, their hushed whispers like knives slicing through her already frayed nerves. Her heart pounded as the officers addressed her, their voices calm but firm. "Miss Scott, we need you to come with us," one of them said, motioning toward a discreet corridor just off the main terminal walkway. The tone was professional, but the implication was clear. This wasn't a request. Miranda's mouth went dry. "Is this really necessary?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. "I haven't done anything wrong." The officer didn't waver. "We've been asked to escort you for questioning regarding an incident on this flight. The airline's executive office has requested immediate documentation of the events." Miranda hesitated. She wanted to argue, to insist that she was simply doing her job. But deep down, she knew this was beyond her control now. Her mistake had spiraled into something far greater than she had anticipated. Swallowing her pride, she nodded and stepped forward, her pulse hammering as the officers guided her toward an employee-only area. As she walked through the terminal, the reality of her situation hit her like a freight train. The very same airline she had dedicated years of her life to was now treating her like a liability. A few of her fellow flight attendants lingered near the gate, their expressions a mix of shock and quiet understanding. Dennis, the senior crew member who had warned her earlier, met her gaze from a distance. He didn't say anything, but the slight shake of his head spoke volumes. "I told you this would happen." Passengers from the flight, people who had watched Ava Carter be unfairly removed from first class, were now watching her instead. Some whispered among themselves, while others stared outright, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and satisfaction. Miranda's cheeks burned with embarrassment. Had they all sensed her mistake before she had? Ava Carter, meanwhile, had already moved on. She stood near the baggage claim, her phone in hand, speaking quietly to someone on the other end. She wasn't gloating, wasn't reveling in what had just unfolded. Instead, she remained as composed as ever, handling the situation with the same precision and calm that had defined her from the beginning. Inside the airport's security office, Miranda was led to a small, sterile-looking conference room. The walls were bare except for a single airline policy chart, and a long table stretched across the center. The officers gestured for her to sit. She hesitated before lowering herself into the chair, her back stiff with tension. A moment later, a woman in a sleek business suit stepped inside. She carried a tablet and a folder, her expression unreadable. Miranda recognized her immediately, Charlotte Reynolds, the airline's corporate investigator. "Miss Scott," Charlotte began, setting the folder down in front of her. "We need to discuss the events that took place on Flight 287. Miranda's fingers clenched in her lap. "Of course," she said, her voice clipped, "but I don't understand why I'm being treated like a criminal. I followed procedure." Charlotte lifted an eyebrow. "Did you?" She flipped open the folder and slid a document across the table. It was a printed transcript of the initial report filed against her. Miranda's name was listed at the top, along with the details of her decision to remove Ava Carter from first class. The language was neutral, but the underlying message was clear. Her actions were being scrutinized at the highest level. "We have statements from multiple passengers," Charlotte continued, "as well as a direct complaint from a board member. You do realize Miss Carter has significant ties to this airline, correct?" Miranda's stomach turned. I didn't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Charlotte leaned forward slightly. "That's the problem, Miss Scott. You made a decision based on an assumption rather than policy. And now, the airline is facing a serious reputational issue." Miranda's mind raced. She had spent years enforcing the rules, ensuring passengers followed protocol, and maintaining order. But now, she was the one under scrutiny. The very company she had represented so diligently was distancing itself from her, making it clear that she was on her own. Charlotte sighed, tapping her fingers against the table. "The board will review this matter in full. Until then, you are officially suspended from duty pending investigation." Miranda felt the air leave her lungs. Suspended? The word felt heavy. Final. Charlotte nodded. Effective immediately. You will be notified of the next steps in the coming days. Miranda's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the document in front of her. She had known this was bad, but hearing the words aloud made it all too real. The weight of her decision, one she had once been so sure of, was now crashing down on her in the worst way possible. Meanwhile, outside in the terminal, Ava Carter placed her phone back into her bag and pulled her suitcase from the baggage carousel. She had never sought to humiliate Miranda or ruin her career. But she also knew that people like Miranda, people who made decisions based on bias rather than fact, needed to be held accountable. As she exited the airport, Ava allowed herself one final glance over her shoulder. Somewhere inside, Miranda was being forced to confront the consequences of her actions. It wasn't revenge, it was justice. And while Miranda's fate was still uncertain, one thing was clear: the days of making unchecked, biased decisions without repercussions were over. And Ava Carter had made sure of that. Ava Carter stepped through the automatic doors of the airport, the cool evening air brushing against her face as she wheeled her sleek black suitcase behind her. The hum of activity around her, the chatter of passengers greeting loved ones, the beeping of taxis pulling up to the curb, was a stark contrast to the quiet victory she carried within her. She had expected this outcome from the moment Miranda Scott made the mistake of challenging her place in first class. But she had never needed to force it. She had simply allowed the truth to reveal itself. Now, as she walked toward the car waiting for her at the curb, she felt no need to look back. Whatever was happening inside the airport, whatever consequences were unfolding for Miranda, were no longer her concern. She had done her part, and the weight of the moment belonged to the airline now. She slid into the backseat of the waiting sedan, the soft leather cool against her skin as she settled in. Her driver, William, a longtime employee of her family's business, glanced at her through the rearview mirror. Everything go as expected, Miss Carter? Ava's lips curled slightly, though the expression was far from gloating. Exactly as expected, she said smoothly, fastening her seatbelt. She pulled out her phone and checked her messages. As anticipated, an email from the airline's executive office had already arrived. She opened it, scanning the carefully worded response. We sincerely regret the incident that occurred on Flight 287. Please know that a full internal review is underway, and immediate steps are being taken to ensure this does not happen again. We deeply value your business and appreciate your patience as we address this matter. Ava exhaled softly, locking the screen. The language was corporate, measured, and predictably diplomatic, but underneath the formalities, the message was clear. We know we messed up, and we know who you are. It wasn't just about an apology, it was about self-preservation. The airline had no interest in being associated with discrimination, especially against someone with direct ties to its board. Ava had made sure of that, not through outbursts or threats, but through precision. As the car pulled onto the highway, Ava leaned back against the seat, her eyes briefly closing. She wasn't naive. She knew that Miranda Scott wasn't the first flight attendant to act on bias. And she wouldn't be the last. But today's events weren't just about her own experience. They were about sending a message. A precedent had been set, a reminder that assumptions had consequences, and that power wielded carelessly could just as easily be stripped away. Inside the airport, Miranda sat alone in the security office, staring blankly at the table in front of her. The room was quiet now, the officers having stepped out to finalize their reports. The silence pressed in on her, heavy and suffocating. It wasn't just the suspension, it was the knowledge that her career, her carefully built reputation, had been fractured in a way that might never be repaired. She had underestimated Ava Carter. She had assumed her authority as a flight attendant would shield her from scrutiny, that her actions would go unchallenged. But she had been wrong. For years, Miranda had believed she could rely on her instincts, that she could tell at a glance who belonged where. But now, sitting in that cold, windowless room, she realized those instincts had failed her. Worse, they had betrayed her. She had made a decision based not on policy, not on protocol, but on an unconscious bias she could no longer ignore. And now, she was paying the price. Back in the sedan, Ava's phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Daniel Foster. the executive at the airline who had intervened on her behalf. The board is aware. Expect an official response within 48 hours. Let me know if you'd like a direct statement from the CEO. Ava considered the offer, then typed a brief reply. Not necessary. The actions will speak louder than the statement. She had no interest in a performative apology. No need for grand gestures of atonement. The real victory was in the systemic changes that would follow, the policies that would be reevaluated, the training that would be reinforced, and the quiet but certain ripple effect that would reach beyond this one flight. Ava's thoughts briefly drifted back to Miranda. Would she learn from this? Would she reflect on her mistake? Or would she cling to the idea that she had simply been unlucky, that she had only been caught because Ava wasn't just another passenger? Ava didn't know, and she didn't particularly care. Change didn't require her to hold on to Miranda's fate. The airline would handle her. The board would make its decision. And Ava would continue forward, just as she always had. The city lights blurred past as the car neared her destination. And for the first time since boarding Flight 287, Ava allowed herself a moment of stillness. She had done what needed to be done. The rest would unfold as it should. With one last glance at her phone, she powered off the screen and set it aside. Then, with a quiet breath, she looked out the window, watching as the skyline stretched before her. It was a reminder of what she already knew, this moment. This victory was just a small part of a much larger picture, and Ava Carter had no intention of stopping here. Miranda Scott sat in the sterile, windowless conference room at the airline's headquarters, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The walls were bare except for a framed corporate mission statement that now felt like an unspoken judgment. Mocking the ideals she had once thought she upheld, fairness, professionalism, respect. She had spent years perfecting her role, believing she understood the rules of the industry. But now, she was the one under scrutiny. Across the table sat 3 senior executives, their expressions neutral but firm, each one holding a copy of the official report detailing the incident on Flight 287. The lead investigator, a woman with sharp features and a crisp navy blazer, folded her hands atop the documents. "Miss Scott," she began, her voice even but unyielding, "we've completed our review of the events regarding your handling of a first-class passenger. After careful consideration, the airline has reached a decision regarding your employment." Miranda swallowed hard, her throat dry. She had known this was coming, had felt it in every agonizing moment since she stepped off that flight. The phone calls, the formal summons to headquarters, the whispers among her colleagues, it had all been leading to this. Still, hearing it spoken aloud made the reality of it hit like a gut punch. She forced herself to meet the woman's gaze, but her confidence had long since drained away. "I understand," she said, though the words felt hollow. The investigator nodded, flipping open a file. "To be clear, this decision was not made lightly. We reviewed all available evidence, including statements from multiple passengers, flight crew members, and Miss Carter herself. We also analyzed security footage from the aircraft, which provided a clear account of the events." She glanced up, giving Miranda a measured look. "Your actions on Flight 287 were found to be inconsistent with the airline's commitment to unbiased service and passenger rights." Miranda felt a flicker of frustration flare inside her, but she suppressed it. She had tried to explain, tried to justify her decision. She had told them that she was following her instincts, that something about Ava Carter had seemed off, that she had acted out of an abundance of caution. But each time, her own explanations had unraveled under scrutiny. Her instincts, it turned out, had been nothing more than unconscious bias, and the airline had no tolerance for that. The investigator continued, "Effective immediately. You are suspended from duty. Pending termination." The finality of it settled in Miranda's chest like a weight she couldn't shake. She had held on to some small hope that she might escape with a warning, a temporary leave, or perhaps even mandatory training. But termination? The word alone sent a fresh wave of humiliation crashing over her. I've been with this airline for years," she said finally, her voice quieter than she intended. "I've always been a dedicated employee." One of the other executives, an older man with silver-rimmed glasses, leaned forward slightly. "Your record reflects that," he acknowledged, "which is why this decision is particularly disappointing. However, We cannot overlook the severity of what occurred. Miss Carter was a paying first-class passenger with a valid ticket. She was removed without justification. And worse, the situation escalated to the point that the executive office had to intervene mid-flight. Miranda flinched at the reminder. It had been bad enough when the captain reprimanded her, but hearing it laid out in such stark terms made it feel even more damning. The older man sighed. The airline cannot afford incidents like this. Miss Scott, not only was this an unacceptable breach of protocol, but the fact that it involved someone with direct ties to our board of directors made it even more damaging. Miranda bit the inside of her cheek, resisting the urge to argue. If I had known she was connected to the board, I wouldn't have, but she cut off the thought as soon as it formed. That wasn't the point. She shouldn't have needed to know who Ava Carter was to treat her with respect. And yet, she had made a decision based on an assumption. And now, it was costing her everything. The investigator gave her a moment before speaking again. You will receive formal notice of your termination in writing, along with details regarding severance and the return of your uniform and credentials. She slid a document across the table. This outlines the airline's decision. We ask that you review and sign it before leaving today. Miranda stared at the paper, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for it. The words blurred for a moment before coming into focus. Suspension leading to termination of employment due to violation of airline policy regarding passenger rights and service standards. It was official. Her career with the airline was over. A long silence stretched across the room as she processed the reality of what was happening. The people across from her waited patiently, their expressions unchanged. They had made their decision, and there was no room for debate. Finally, Miranda picked up the pen resting beside the document and signed her name. The moment the ink met the paper, she felt a strange hollowness settle inside her. She pushed the document back across the table and stood, smoothing down her uniform out of habit, though she knew she would never wear it again. The investigator nodded. Thank you. A member of HR will escort you to collect your belongings. Without another word, Miranda turned and walked toward the door, her posture still upright, though every step felt heavier than the last. As she stepped into the hallway, she saw Dennis standing a few feet away. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't gloating. He simply gave her a slow nod, one that carried a mixture of pity and inevitability. She held his gaze for a second before looking away, shame creeping into every part of her being. Outside, the airport buzzed with life, passengers and crew members moving about as if nothing had changed. But for Miranda, everything had. The airline she had given years of her life to had just severed ties with her in the most public way possible. There would be no quiet resignation, no graceful exit. Everyone would know. Meanwhile, somewhere across the city, Ava Carter was already moving on. She had never set out to ruin Miranda's career, but she had also known from the start that this wasn't just about her. It was about making sure this kind of treatment didn't happen to anyone else. She had done what she needed to do, and now, the airline was ensuring accountability. As Miranda stepped outside the building, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows on the pavement, she realized something that sent a fresh wave of regret through her. She had always believed that power lay in authority, in the ability to make decisions and enforce rules. But Ava Carter had shown her something different. True power lay in knowing when to fight back, and how to do so without ever raising your voice. And in that moment, Miranda understood. She had never stood a chance. Ava Carter had never been one to settle for a temporary fix. It would have been easy to accept the airline's apology, let them handle Miranda Scott's termination, and move on with her life. But that wasn't enough. This wasn't just about one flight attendant making a bad judgment call. It was about an entire system that allowed these types of injustices to happen in the first place. Ava knew that if she let this go, the cycle would repeat itself. Someone else, on some other flight, would be humiliated the way she had been, and maybe that person wouldn't have the connections or influence to fight back. That was why, as she sat in the corner office of the airline's corporate headquarters, facing a panel of executives, she made it clear, her involvement in this situation was far from over. Miss Carter, the CEO, Richard Hale, began, adjusting his tie as he spoke. We sincerely regret what occurred on Flight 287. I want to personally assure you that the matter has been dealt with. His voice was smooth, diplomatic, the well-rehearsed tone of a man who had spent years extinguishing corporate fires. The flight attendant responsible is no longer with the airline. We have addressed the situation appropriately. Ava met his gaze without blinking. I appreciate the swift action, she said evenly, but I hope you understand that firing one employee isn't a solution. It's damage control. Hale hesitated, shifting slightly in his seat. The other executives, seated in a neat row along the glossy conference table, exchanged brief glances, sensing that this meeting wasn't going to be the routine follow-up they had expected. Ava continued, her tone calm but firm. Let me be clear. I'm not here for apologies or public relations statements. I'm here to make sure that this doesn't happen again. Not to me, not to anyone else. She leaned forward slightly. And that means systemic change. One of the executives, a woman in a navy blazer, folded her hands on the table. We are prepared to implement new training programs, she offered, including enhanced bias and diversity training for our flight crews. Ava nodded but didn't let them off the hook that easily. That's a start, but it's not enough. She pulled out a file from her bag and placed it on the table, sliding it toward the CEO. I did some research. Over the past 3 years, there have been at least a dozen complaints similar to mine. Some resulted in formal investigations. Most didn't, but all of them point to the same issue. Your airline has a pattern. The room fell uncomfortably silent. Ava let the moment stretch just long enough to make her point. Bias isn't just an individual problem, it's a structural one. Your training needs to be more than a box to check off. It needs to be enforced, monitored, and evaluated for real effectiveness. And it doesn't stop with your crew. It needs to extend to hiring practices, promotions, and how complaints are handled internally. She paused, then added, because if I didn't have the connections I do, I doubt this would have been taken as seriously as it was. No one in the room contradicted her. Hale cleared his throat. What exactly are you proposing, Miss Carter? Ava sat back, her posture composed but unyielding. A third-party oversight committee, she said. Independent audits of discrimination complaints. Mandatory refresher training every 6 months. Not just once a year. And clear consequences for violations, documented, enforced, and transparent. She glanced around the table. You need to change the culture of this airline. Not just respond when someone with influence calls you out. The executives shifted in their seats. Considering her words, Hale exhaled slowly, rubbing his chin. These are significant measures, he admitted. They are, Ava agreed, and they're necessary. A long pause followed. Then, finally, Hale nodded. We'll review your recommendations and discuss implementation strategies. Ava smiled faintly, knowing she had just won the first battle. I'll be expecting updates, she said smoothly, because I intend to make sure these changes happen. As she left the conference room, she felt no lingering anger. No bitterness, only certainty. Miranda Scott's termination had been an outcome, but not a solution. The real victory would come when no passenger ever had to experience what she did. And Ava Carter was going to make sure of that. Miranda Scott sat in her small, dimly lit apartment, staring at the termination letter that lay on her kitchen table. The paper was crisp, official, and final, a single sheet that represented the abrupt and humiliating end of a career she had spent years building. Just days ago, she had walked through the airport with confidence, her uniform pristine, her authority unquestioned. Now, she had nowhere to be, no shifts to prepare for, and no sense of direction. The weight of her actions pressed down on her like a lead blanket. Suffocating and inescapable, she had spent years believing she understood people, believing she had good instincts about who belonged where. But now, sitting alone with nothing but time to think, she was forced to confront a truth she had long ignored. Her instincts had been wrong. She had replayed the moment over and over in her mind, the way she had approached Ava Carter. The way she had scrutinized her ticket as though it couldn't possibly be real. The way she had coldly insisted that she move to economy without any legitimate reason. In the moment, it had felt justified. She had told herself she was maintaining order, upholding standards, ensuring first class remained as it was meant to be. But now, with the benefit of painful hindsight, she saw it for what it truly was, bias. A quiet, insidious prejudice that had shaped her decision-making without her even realizing it. Or worse, Maybe she had realized it but had refused to acknowledge it. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her laptop. For days, she had avoided reading about the incident, too ashamed to see what people were saying. But she knew she couldn't hide from it forever. With a deep breath, she opened her email and clicked on the news link that had been forwarded to her by a former colleague. The headline was blunt. Airline implements new anti-bias policies following first-class discrimination incident. She scrolled through the article, her stomach tightening as she read the details. Ava Carter hadn't just walked away after the flight, she had used the moment to push for systemic change. The airline had already announced the introduction of new oversight committees, stricter bias training, and clear consequences for violations. Ava hadn't just held Miranda accountable, she had held the entire system accountable. And that, more than anything, made Miranda realize just how much she had underestimated her. A part of her wanted to be angry, wanted to convince herself that she had been unfairly singled out. But she couldn't. She had brought this on herself. She had taken one look at Ava Carter and decided, without reason, that she didn't belong in first class. She had spoken to her with condescension, dismissed her valid questions, and wielded her authority recklessly. And Ava, in return, had responded with the kind of patience and composure that now made Miranda's actions look even worse by comparison. Closing the article, Miranda stared at the blank email draft on her screen. She had thought about reaching out before, but shame had stopped her. What could she possibly say? That she was sorry? That she hadn't meant to humiliate her? That she wasn't a bad person? None of that mattered. Intentions didn't erase impact. Excuses wouldn't undo what had already been done. Ava had given her a chance to reflect, to learn, to see herself clearly, and Miranda knew that the only thing left to do was take responsibility. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she finally began typing. Subject: My apology. Dear Miss Carter, I don't expect you to read this, and I certainly don't expect your forgiveness. But I need to say this regardless. I owe you an apology, not just for how I treated you on that flight, but for the deeper issue behind my actions. I see now that my judgment of you had nothing to do with policy and everything to do with my own assumptions. And for that, I am deeply sorry. When I removed you from first class, I thought I was doing my job. I convinced myself that I was acting professionally, that I was making a reasonable decision. But the truth is, I acted without justification. I allowed bias to influence me, whether I was conscious of it or not. And because of that, I put you in a situation that was unfair, humiliating, and unacceptable. You had every right to be in that seat. You had every right to question me. And you had every right to push back against what I did. Since losing my job, I've had a lot of time to reflect. I've read about the changes you've helped implement. And I know that your goal was never just to hold me accountable, it was to make sure this never happens to anyone else. And for that, I respect you. I know words aren't enough. But I want you to know that I'm taking this seriously. I have begun educating myself on the biases that I once ignored. I am listening, learning, and making sure that if I ever work in a position of authority again, I will never make the same mistake. I don't expect a response. I don't expect redemption. I just wanted you to hear this directly from me. I was wrong. And I am sorry. Sincerely, Miranda Scott. Miranda stared at the message for a long moment before hitting send. A strange mixture of emotions settled over her: relief, regret, and the undeniable understanding that her journey was only beginning. She had lost her job, but maybe, just maybe, she had gained something more valuable: the ability to truly see herself for the first time. Ava Carter had never sought personal revenge. From the moment Miranda Scott humiliated her on Flight 287, she hadn't been concerned with retribution, she had been focused on something bigger. It would have been easy to accept the airline's apology, to let Miranda's termination serve as closure, and to move on with her life. But Ava understood that if she did nothing more, the cycle would continue. Somewhere down the line, another flight attendant would make a similar assumption about another passenger who didn't look the part. Another paying customer would be quietly shuffled to the back of the plane under the guise of a misunderstanding. The next person might not have the connections Ava did. They might not have the resources to fight back. And that, more than anything, was what had driven her to push for systemic change. As she sat in her office weeks later, reviewing the final documents from the airline's board of directors, She saw her efforts reflected in more than just words. The airline had committed to a complete overhaul of its training programs, implementing stricter oversight on bias-related incidents, increasing diversity in leadership, and creating a third-party review system for discrimination complaints. These weren't just empty promises, they were concrete steps toward meaningful change. And Ava had ensured that they were not just performative gestures to save face but real policies with real consequences. She had seen to it that these measures would be publicly reported, holding the airline accountable beyond a private corporate memo. A soft knock at her office door pulled her from her thoughts. Maya, her assistant, stepped in, holding a folder. "You might want to see this," she said, placing the document on Ava's desk. "It's an internal report. Several other airlines are now reviewing their policies in response to what happened with your case." Ava raised an eyebrow, flipping through the pages. She had expected this situation to make waves, but seeing the tangible ripple effect was still surprising. Airlines across the country were quietly revisiting their policies, revising training protocols, and re-evaluating their own complaint handling processes. Even those who had initially dismissed the incident as an isolated case were now recognizing the need to address systemic bias in their operations. Maya hesitated for a moment before adding, "You've done more than just hold one airline accountable. Ava, you've changed the conversation." Ava exhaled slowly, letting that truth settle over her. She had always been strategic in her actions, but she hadn't realized just how far-reaching the impact would be. This wasn't just about her experience on one flight. It was about an entire industry being forced to acknowledge and confront an issue that had long been ignored. Her phone buzzed on her desk, pulling her attention away from the report. A new email notification flashed across the screen. Subject: "Thank you." Ava clicked it open, her eyes scanning the message. It was from a young professional who had read about her case. "I wanted to reach out to say thank you. I've had similar experiences in corporate spaces where I was made to feel like I didn't belong. Seeing someone like you stand up and actually make a difference gives me hope that things can change. Because of you, I spoke up at my workplace about an issue I would have normally let slide. Just thought you should know." Ava leaned back in her chair, a faint but genuine smile forming. This was the kind of victory that mattered, not just policy changes, but people feeling empowered to demand better. Meanwhile, across town, Miranda Scott sat in a small coffee shop, scrolling through the latest airline news on her phone. She had been avoiding anything related to Flight 287 for weeks. But today, something compelled her to look. She read through the article detailing the industry-wide policy changes, the shifts happening because of Ava Carter's actions. For the first time since losing her job, she felt something beyond shame. She felt understanding. Ava hadn't gone after her out of spite. She had gone after the system that allowed people like Miranda to make unchecked, biased decisions, and she had won. Miranda closed the article and took a deep breath. She had spent so much time resenting what happened, but now, she realized that her downfall had been inevitable. If not Ava, it would have been someone else. The system was changing, whether she liked it or not. And maybe, just maybe, she needed to change too. Back in her office, Ava finished reading the email and placed her phone down. She had fought for something bigger than herself, and the results spoke for themselves. There was still more work to do, there always was. But for now, she allowed herself a rare moment of satisfaction. She had turned injustice into action. And that, more than anything, was the true victory. In today's world, where social media and technology hold companies accountable more than ever, stories like Ava Carter's remind us how much power individuals have when they stand up against injustice. Discrimination, whether subtle or blatant, still happens in many industries, from air travel to corporate offices. But unlike before, people now have platforms to share their experiences, demand change, and ensure accountability. Ava didn't just fight for herself, she set a precedent that forced an entire airline to rethink its policies. Her story proves that one moment of courage can lead to systemic change. What do you think about this situation? Was Miranda's punishment fair, or do you think the airline acted too harshly? Should companies do more to prevent these types of incidents before they happen, rather than only reacting when they receive backlash? Now, put yourself in Ava's shoes. If you were in her position, Unjustly removed from a seat you rightfully paid for, how would you have responded? Would you have taken action like Ava did? Or would you have let it go? On the other hand, if you were Miranda, what would you have done differently to avoid this outcome? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever faced a similar situation? Or do you think companies today are doing enough to address bias and discrimination? Let's discuss.